Great, welcome back. Someone just asked a very good question. There are some questions on the syllabus that you can write a memo or a paper in response to. There are different questions on the website, so the question is, which ones are we supposed to answer? And my answer is any ones you choose. That is, the questions are meant to guide your thinking. You may come up with a completely different question from the readings or from what I say in class or from your own readings on the Constitution, and you're free to explore that. So the questions are guides. I'm not saying, okay, you need to answer so many from the syllabus and so many on the website. They're there to help you, believe it or not. Okay, so any other questions? Now that I've answered one that one brave soul was shrewd enough to bring up. Okay, good. Last time when we were here, I kind of got caught up in some subjects I hadn't meant to be discussing that were pertinent to the course, and didn't have time to talk about all of the interesting things happening in the era of the Revolution. And there are a couple that are too significant to leave out. One, of course, is the Declaration of Independence, one of the great documents in the history of the world, and important to think about for what it says about government. As we talked last time about the Pennsylvania Constitution and the Massachusetts Constitution, and I think I also talked a little bit about the Virginia Constitution, and they all share certain assumptions about government. I mean, the fact that these constitutions all begin with a declaration of rights. That is the purpose of having a government. And you're probably familiar with it's the second paragraph of the Declaration that gets us all excited. Actually, at the time, it wasn't. At the time, the significant parts were the list of charges against the king. But that statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So self-evident truths are things that are just obvious. They don't need to be argued. These are our basic assumptions. Okay, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, instituting in its place a new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. This is really a classic rhetorical formulation where you lead from one premise to the next. So the basic premise, all men are created equal. And we could spend probably the rest of the semester discussing exactly what this means, since you may or may not agree with that particular statement, but for the Congress in 1776, this was a basic assumption. And remember, the purpose of the Declaration was not to announce some new political theory or to enunciate something that was going to shock or startle us. It was meant as an organizing document to bring people together. This was our basic platform. So the authors of the Declaration had to write it in such a way that it would attract support, not only from a handful of guys in Philadelphia, but from urban folks in Boston, farmers, from planters in Georgia and South Carolina and Virginia, from people throughout the United States. And I remember, too, the document is meant for a candid world. And that's what it says in the first sentence. We're presenting this to a candid world. So it's not meant for the rest of the world to say, boy, those Americans are really whacked. The purpose is for the rest of the world to say, well, that's right. All men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That is, You don't have these rights because the king was a nice guy and said, hey, why don't I let you have certain inalienable rights? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're yours just because you're alive. In order to protect those rights, people have created governments. Probably not a novel idea to those of you who have read Locke. Certainly it's not a novel idea. But the reason you have a government is to protect these rights. Really not to do anything else. We'll come back to this in a couple of weeks when we talk about Jefferson as president. But this is the fundamental idea here about the purpose of government, and it's why you see the beginnings of the state constitutions having declarations of rights. This is why we're creating a government, in order to protect these rights. And then whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, the people have a right to alter or abolish it. And then there's this little qualification, don't do it for some light or transient thing. You don't like the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit or something like that. But a long train of abuses and usurpations evincing a design to reduce them under absolute despotism. So you have a long string of things, and that's why you then have this list of charges against the king, all showing this tendency or this pattern to reduce the people of these colonies under despotic rule. And very interesting series of charges. And someone mentioned last week, all of this antagonism seemed to be directed against Parliament. How does the king come into it? And it's really in July of 1776. For some reason, the Congress isn't going to charge Parliament with these things, but instead focuses on the king, and perhaps it's because the idea had been we can remain self-governing entities with the king as the figurehead, because the king, under our theory, really wants to do good. He's just been misled by some bad ministers and by a runaway parliament, but he himself really wants the best for the empire. The Declaration says, no, the king is at fault here, and we have to cut our ties, not only with the king, but with the British people. There's a paragraph in there toward the end about our British brethren and how disappointed we are in them because they haven't come to our assistance. The ties of consanguinity, one of the few really long words in the Declaration. They have been deaf to these ties. Therefore, we hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, and peace friends. Okay? So, the king, people of England, this is it for you. I mean, we've been telling Parliament for 10 years to lay off. They haven't. Okay, so we're not addressing anything more to Parliament, but now it's the king, the English people we're really disappointed in because, as we've just said, we have this fundamental right, a fundamental duty to protect our inalienable rights. Inalienable meaning rights that cannot be taken away. And what are the inalienable rights? Very good. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, very good. If we were having a test, I would ask you to define them. So this is a fundamental statement, and as I said, at the time it wasn't controversial, at least among the folks proposing independence or those who came to see this is the end. And it was meant to be read. That is, copies were printed up for distribution throughout the now states. And incidentally, just as a matter of record for Americans, we stop calling them colonies as of July 2nd, 1776. And then they become states. So, remember, this whole declaration had been set in motion by a resolution proposed by the Virginia Assembly that these 13 colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that any ties between them and the state of Great Britain are and ought to be totally dissolved. So that's the resolution from Virginia, which Congress adopted on July 2nd, 1776. Declaring independence. And then 2 days later, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, which then was promulgated, printed up, sent out, and read. It arrived in Boston, I think, on July 18th, and it was read from the balcony of the old State House. reached New York on July 9th, where Washington had it read to his troops. Now, as his troops were having this read to them, they could see in New York Harbor the largest British fleet ever sent across the ocean coming to suppress them. Must have been really a dramatic time in New York, the reading of the Declaration with the arrival of this British force that was going to put an end to all of this nonsense. So, you have the Declaration, which is not intended to break new ground, but it is meant as a rallying point, which it certainly was and certainly is. You can't have any kind of a discussion of Americans or American identity without somehow getting back to the Declaration. Any questions on this? Yes, sir.
What was England's reaction to the Declaration?
What was England's reaction to the Declaration? Well, they didn't say, oh, well, you put it that way. Funny thing, July 4th is a date that looms large in our history. The king, of course, he wouldn't receive the Declaration until August, but he wrote in his diary on July 4th, another uneventful day. And July 4th was also a high point in the political career of Thomas Hutchinson, the governor of Massachusetts, fifth generation Bostonian, who had been sent into exile in 1774. And on July 4th, 1776, he received an honorary degree from Oxford. Of course, they didn't know that what was happening across the Atlantic. In 1776, there's still every expectation that this rebellion is going to end. In fact, if we were going to be talking about the military history of the war, we'd say, boy, the end of 1776, things look really bleak. By September, Washington's army has been driven out of New York and is being driven across New Jersey. I should say forced across New Jersey. You say driven across New Jersey, it conjures up different images. And it was dwindling. There had been 30,000 men during the battle in New York, in the battles of White Plains. By the time Washington reached the Delaware, he had about 3,000. The other guys just went home. They knew this was a failure. So what would have been the reaction had it been? Well, probably pretty uneventful. It would have been yet another of these documents that arises, some people spouting off about something and then quickly forgotten. Later on, it becomes much more important, and that would be an interesting thing to trace. In fact, some historians have looked at the subsequent history of the Declaration and its influence around the world. Good question, what was England's reaction? Well, not much. And in fact, at the time, I mentioned last time, Jefferson, who was the principal author of the Declaration, was really miffed that he had to be in Philadelphia writing this when he could be in Virginia writing the Constitution. And John Adams, who was actually chair of the committee to draft the Declaration, appointed Jefferson to do it, mainly, I think, because Adams was busy writing more important things, such as the treaties that the Congress hoped to work out with the Dutch and the French and other potential allies, which was much more important. And the reason you have a declaration is to make it clear to these potential allies that this isn't just a resistance movement. We hope to get some concessions from the British Crown, and afterwards we'll be friends again. Why would the French or the Dutch or anyone else support these folks if they know they're going to go back to being part of the British Empire again and do what the British Empire has been doing, which is running the world? And so you have to declare independence really for the rest of the world to lay this before a candid world. Of course, Louis XVI, the King of France, isn't going to read the Declaration and tremble. Well, you might tremble because they're saying all men are created equal and have certain natural inalienable rights. So what does that say about these other countries which didn't say, the reason you have a King of France is to protect the rights of the people of France? France, incidentally, becomes the first country to recognize American independence, and that is in January of 1778. Right? So it's a year and a half later before anyone else, other countries say, okay, we'll recognize this entry. Anyone know what the second country is, by the way, to recognize American independence? Yes?
I thought it was Morocco.
It is Morocco. Very good. The King of Morocco, Sultan of Morocco, recognizes American independence. And then Holland and other lesser principalities. So, how did you happen to know that?
Just random things that I know about history.
Very good. Okay. So, when I think for us, one of the really perplexing things about the Declaration, unless anyone else has other things they want to ask about it. Anyone? Okay, this statement, which is treated as simply a self-evident truth in the first part of this string of reasons for having a government. That is this notion that all men are created equal, and we like to ask, well, how could these guys have said this when, in fact, they own slaves? It's a good question. Did they mean it? And in the 19th century, it became the fashion to say, well, of course, they could not have meant it. How could they mean this when, in fact, Jefferson owned slaves and Washington owned slaves? And you'll recall what Samuel Johnson said in 1773. Did I mention this? Johnson wrote a pamphlet in 1773 called Taxation Without Representation is Not Tyranny. And he really came right to the point. And he didn't like Americans. And he said, first paragraph of this, how is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes? Good question. How is it? And here you have these slaveholders in Congress writing this declaration saying all men are created equal, are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, what does that mean if you're born a slave on a plantation in Virginia or on a farm in Massachusetts? Were these guys just base hypocrites? What do they mean by this? Yes?
All men are equal under the law?
That could be all men are equal under the law, but still the law treats you differently if you're a slave and if you're not a slave. Yes, sir?
I think it was more about recognizing who was a man versus what they considered property, what they considered less than a man. I mean, it was stripped out as 3/5 of a man. Also, I know that the northern bodies wanted to carry favor with the southern states, so that's why it kind of skirted around that issue.
Okay, so you've brought up a couple of subsequent things. When the Congress is created, actually this becomes the rule in the 1780s over taxation for how will you tax property? How will you tax property? Will there be a head tax? What will we have? And the Congress determined for levies of taxes, they would count slaves as 3/5 of a person. That is, we'll have a head tax, but slaves will only count as 3 for every 5. And then in 1787, at the time of the drafting of the Constitution, which we'll probably talk about next week, they carry that over into representation in Congress. Okay, will you count the slaves of Virginia for representation in Congress, which would give Virginia a lot of representatives for people who can't vote? South Carolina, more than half of the population actually are slaves. So will those folks in South Carolina be allowed to will there be representatives from South Carolina representing people who don't vote, which means that the white folks who do vote will have 2 representatives more than they should have? It's a big question. And here in the Declaration, I mean, they're not getting into this really nuanced thing. How is this going to play out? Remember, this is a statement meant to draw support, and it's not a law. The Declaration is not a law, just remember that. It's a great document, great state paper, doesn't have any standing if you go into court. So just remember that. So here they're enunciating this broad principle, and later on in the 19th century it becomes the norm to say they could not have thought that slaves actually were men. So, yeah, they can say all men are created equal, but we just mean men like us. In fact, that's what the Supreme Court says in 1857 in the Dred Scott case, that at the time the Constitution was written, a black man had no rights which a white man was bound to respect. But that's a historical reading of this. We don't have anyone in 1776 saying that. We just mean white folks. In fact, I did see a textbook recently that had a little footnote in the Declaration. It said all men are created equal, and the footnote said, and they meant women too, which I don't think they did. I did think they meant men generally, but trying to make it nicer, I suppose. Yes, you had your hand up.
Oh, I was just going to say that it's not legally binding, that it's rhetoric.
It is rhetoric, sure, but doesn't mean anything. Rhetoric can be very important It can be a fundamental touchstone, or it can just be something nice to say as a way of gulling the masses. Let's just talk a little bit about how this might have more substance, because this is an important notion. If you look at the language of the Declaration, and you look at the language of, say, the first article of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, they look strikingly similar. George Mason wrote this in June of 1776. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights. Okay? Born free and equal. Certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights of which they cannot be divested. Does that suggest that he's thinking some are more equal than others? It's a puzzling thing. He proposed this. He wrote a draft of the Virginia Constitution, proposed it in the General Assembly of Virginia, and the smart lawyers there said, well, we can't adopt this because 40% of the people in Virginia actually have been divested of their natural, essential, and inalienable rights. So they changed it. They added a clause. All men are born free and equal, have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot be divested. They create this fiction that the people we hold as slaves at some point had divested themselves of these rights, before they entered into a state of society. Now, we know this wasn't exactly true. It wasn't exactly the way it happened. These folks, the ancestors of these people who were slaves in Virginia, did not willingly divest themselves of their rights, but these smart lawyers in Virginia have to say they do, otherwise they can't write this Constitution. To me, this was really striking, that they create this because they recognize that these 40% Virginians who are divested of their rights actually are entitled to their rights. And you can take this a step further and look at what happens in Massachusetts, where they adopted this Constitution, which I talked about last time in 1780, and they didn't change the language. All men are born free and equal, have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights of which they cannot be divested. Now, this might just be rhetoric, a nice thing to say, sounds good in a 4th of July speech, but does it really mean anything? Well, in Virginia, they seem to think that it did, otherwise they wouldn't have to change it. In Massachusetts, what happens is this. Out in Worcester, near Worcester, there is a slave named Quock Walker, owned by a man named Nathaniel Jennison. And Mr. Jennison hires Walker out, and every week Quock Walker has to come back to Mr. Jennison and present him with his wages. And Walker had originally been owned by someone else, a guy named Caldwell, who died, and Walker, who now is in his early 20s, remembers that Caldwell had said, when you're 21, I'll set you free. Caldwell dies, Walker becomes the property of someone else, and now Mr. Jennison says, I didn't promise to set you free, every week you better come back and pay me. And Walker runs away, and Jennison goes to get him, beats him, brings him back to the farm. And Walker actually charges Jennison with assault. And Walker gets a lawyer to take an interest in this. The lawyer's name is Levi Lincoln. No relation to the future president, but Levi Lincoln argues before the courts in Massachusetts that the Massachusetts Constitution says all men are born free and equal, have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights of which they cannot be divested, and then it enumerates some of these rights. To control your own labor and own your own property. Essential rights. Mr. Jennison is depriving Mr. Walker of this property, and if the law allows him to do this, the law is in violation of the Massachusetts Constitution, which says all men are born free and equal, have these natural, essential, and inalienable rights. What do you suppose the Massachusetts courts will say to this argument? Excuse me?
They won't agree with it.
You say they won't agree with it.
No.
Why not?
Well, I don't know. That's why
Well, okay, it's a good answer. Why they can probably think of good answers why they wouldn't agree with it. No, they want to maintain the status quo. Usually courts do. They're not the first place you go when you're seeking revolutionary change. If you learn nothing else this semester, let it be that. Yes?
This is the case that abolishes slavery in Massachusetts.
Yeah, so this is the case that abolishes slavery in Massachusetts. The Chief Justice of what becomes the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts, William Cushing, in his charge to the jury, says that the Massachusetts Constitution, which the people of Massachusetts have adopted, seems to have changed our ideas about whether one person can own another. And he remembered the big fight over the 1778 Constitution. One argument people made against it was, it doesn't say anything about slavery. This one doesn't say, the word slavery doesn't appear in it, but it does have this striking first article. And Chief Justice Cushing says, the Constitution of Massachusetts seems to indicate that Mr. Jennison cannot own Mr. Walker, that Mr. Walker, under the laws of the Commonwealth, has natural, essential, and inalienable rights, including the right to own his own labor. So this does essentially abolish slavery in Massachusetts. It does make us think what would have happened had the Virginians not modified their first article. It also it suggests to me, I don't know, maybe I'm just this cockeyed optimist, that when they said all men are created equal, that's really what they meant. They're not going to have a big footnote about how we happen to own slaves, which of course Dr. Johnson and the 600,000 slaves would have wanted to hear. Yes, sir.
Just as a matter of getting the news out, how long did it take before slavery itself was actually abolished in Massachusetts after this verdict?
By 1790, the first federal census doesn't record any slaves in Massachusetts. Okay, and there are a couple of other suits, one involving a woman named Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mumbet, and she and her sister. It's a long story. This happens out in Berkshire County, but it's quite quick, in fact. And Jennison keeps going to the legislature, wanting them to do something to override this, or wanting them to do something to protect his interest in slaves and other slave owners' interest in slaves. Granted, there were not as many slaves in Massachusetts as there were in Virginia or even New York or Connecticut. But it's a significant interest, though. The legislature refuses to do anything about this. So it happens quite quickly. It's not, okay, in Worcester, Jennison can't own Walker, but other slave owners get the message pretty quickly. Any other? Yes, sir.
So do you have any idea of how what percentage of the population in Massachusetts were slaves?
It was relatively small. Probably, and again, slaves in Massachusetts would have been concentrated in urban areas. Many, though, worked as farm laborers, and you can see that the institution itself was ebbing in Massachusetts, but that doesn't mean it would have ended. It might have revived as slavery in America revives after the opening up of the Southwest with the cotton plantations, which we'll talk about in a few weeks. But it is an institution here. It's an important institution. There are people owning slaves. What percentage? I don't know. That would be a good thing to find out. Okay. So why don't you try to do that? Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Well, now you're afraid I'll assign you to answer these things that I should know. Okay, so that's what happens in Massachusetts. Pennsylvania, at about the same time, adopted a gradual emancipation law that said people born as of July 4th of, can't remember the date, it's in the future, will be free when they're 21. It must be 1781. Born July 4th, 1781, you'll be free in 1802. Born on July 3rd, you're a slave for life. If you have children, though, they'll be free when they're 21. So a gradual means gradual. It doesn't mean, a 5-year plan, or some future point. It is some future point. Okay, so the institution of slavery is contradictory to these notions of equality, but it's a contradiction that these guys say. Yes, sir?
If you're one of the slaves that was born after a certain time, once you're 21 and you have kids, do they have to wait until they're 21?
No, they're free. If you're free, they're free. Any other questions? And that actually became the norm in the other states that were abolishing slavery in this time. New York and New Jersey abolished slavery in the first decades of the 19th century. Connecticut in the 1780s, 90s, Rhode Island in the 1790s, and then these other states in later. And there's a debate in Congress in the 1780s about slavery in the Western Territory, that is the territory north of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi, and Congress votes to exclude slavery in that territory after 1800. But that's a story, I don't know, we may get into later on. Any other questions on this? Yes?
A little off topic, but I'm just curious if you know what they ended up doing once the slavery was abolished. Like, did they just start giving them wages? Or
Yeah. Once slavery was abolished, you had had someone who had been working for you, you now pay them. The Adamses, for example, when they had this small house in Quincy, a little farmhouse, and when they went to France, Abigail rented it to this black couple who had been working for them for a number of years. So they live in the Adams house when the Adamses are in France. And there was just a story in the paper yesterday about a house in Concord built in the 1780s by a freed person, or a person, I think he might have been born free. This is an ambiguous thing. There were blacks born free all over the place. In fact, even in Virginia, Jefferson argued a couple of emancipation suits for people wrongfully enslaved. If you could prove that your ancestors were free and you were wrongfully enslaved, you would go to court and argue this. And if you could prove it, then the courts would say, yes, you're wrongfully enslaved, and charge whoever had been enslaving you. So it's a very complicated issue here, and perhaps made more complicated by this assertion that self-evident truth that all men are created equal and have these natural, essential, and inalienable rights. So in 1788, we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks, the Constitution is presented to the states for ratification. The states have conventions, and one of the big arguments against the Constitution, as we'll see, was there is no Bill of Rights. And in the South Carolina Constitutional Convention, one of the proponents of ratifying it addresses this complaint, no Bill of Rights, and he says, Bills of Rights usually begin with an assertion that all men are created equal. He says, well, we would make that assertion with a very ill grace indeed, since most people in South Carolina actually were born slaves. So let's stay away from a Bill of Rights. Okay, any other questions on this?
And the Bill of Rights doesn't begin that way.
Well, no, it doesn't. The Federal Bill of Rights is somewhat different. Okay. But we'll get to that. Okay. I suppose it's the difference having something written by Jefferson and something written by Madison. Okay. Another thing that's really kind of interesting about this period, and we'll get to what leads to the whole breakdown in the 1780s in a bit, is this other question, this perplexing question. It's something that actually sets the United States apart from other countries at the time, and that is what we come to think of as freedom of religion or separation of church and state, which is something that was actually very much contested at this time, actually introduced at this time in many ways. And it's a subject still very important to us. Robert Jackson, who was a Supreme Court justice in the mid-20th century, said one of his opinions, and this was kind of a rhetorical flourish, first in the Bill of Rights because it was first in the minds of the founders, which isn't necessarily true, perhaps, since if you've read the Bill of Rights, you know there are two articles first that the states did not adopt at the time. So what we think of as Article 1 would actually have been Article 3 in 1788, but that's a different story. And I'm not quite sure if it was first in the minds of the founders, but it's a very important thing. Anyway, 1771 in Caroline County, Virginia, just to tell you a story, a Baptist preacher is out in the woods with a bunch of Baptists. Is anyone here a Baptist, by the way? I'm not, okay. Do you want to do a reenactment of this? Okay. Okay. You probably know how the story goes. Baptist preacher singing a hymn with his congregation. A minister from the Church of England arrives. Is anyone here an Episcopalian? Arrives on horseback with a whip. Of course, if you're riding a horse, you're probably going to have a whip. And he, as this Baptist is trying to sing the hymn, the reverend takes his horsewhip and shoves it into the guy's mouth to keep him from singing. Does that ever happen in your church? Oh, good. The sheriff arrives on the scene, and here you have this bunch of Baptists singing hymns, an Episcopal minister on a horse, whipping them, shoving the whip into the minister's throat, and the sheriff arrests someone. Whom does he arrest? The Baptist, exactly, for disturbing the peace, causing a nuisance, and doing other bad things. And he takes the punishment for this Baptist minister is to be flogged publicly in Caroline County's Courthouse Square. Now, the Baptists at this time, I don't know if this is still true, were really threats to the established order in Virginia as in other places, because the Baptists had this idea that in the eyes of God, all souls are equal. God doesn't care if you're rich or poor, slave or free, all souls are equal. And the Baptists also thought the way the Church of England carried on in Virginia and in other places was ridiculous. People would dress up to go to church. And the churches were supported actually by the taxes or the contributions of the vestry and the better sort of people, and they would buy their pews, and it was kind of like, if you have the luxury boxes at the Garden versus those who sit up in the, cheaper seats. We can see Jack Nicholson down at center court at the Lakers games, and we can never aspire to be like that, but we may try. I suppose the people we would aspire to be like in the 18th century would have been different from, say, Jack Nicholson or the kind of characters you may see at courtside. Let's think about another sport analogy. It's hard to think of one where the better sort of people are sitting in the better seats. Excuse me? Robert Kraft is old, but he owns the team, so why shouldn't he be in the luxury boxes? Okay, but in church, better sort of people are sitting in the better seats. It's like these folks are the better sort of people who have paid more, so they get to sit closer to the preacher, right? Those of you in the back, the ones in the balconies really are out of it. And then often a church will have a third balcony for the servants, the slaves, who can just watch this spectacle. And the really well-dressed people come to show off their finery. It's a way of presenting yourself to God and to everyone else. A cultural historian about 20 years ago wrote a whole book on this, talking about how this, what was the word? It was some complicated cultural studies word he used for this. The way it reinforced, a word I can understand, the social stratification of the society being played out in the meeting house every week. And by the way, attendance at the meeting house was required by law. This was true in Virginia. You had to attend the Anglican services, or the Church of England. It was true in Massachusetts, where you had to attend the Congregational Church. And every colony had, except for Rhode Island and Pennsylvania, had an established church. And you also paid taxes to support it. So in Massachusetts, you paid taxes to support the Congregational Church. In Virginia, you paid taxes to support the Episcopal Church. And there's this other story about the Baptists, their way of showing their disdain for all of this. You had to go to the Episcopal Church, and so and you had to dress up. And so the Baptists, to show the ridiculousness of this, would go to the church. And then when you would have to march up to the communion rail, the Baptists would throw off their clothes. Because we all stand naked in the eyes of God, as well as in the eyes of these Episcopalians. So, the Baptists had a reputation in Virginia for being disruptive, intentionally so, because there is a difference between the duty you owe to God and the duty you owe to this particular state. Anyway, I don't know how we got onto this. So the Baptists really were agitating 1760s, 1770s, and not just in Virginia, but in other places. In 1774, when these worthy folks from Massachusetts went down to Philadelphia to argue their case before the Continental Congress, everyone should stand with Massachusetts because the British Crown is oppressing us. John Adams, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Robert Treat Paine. Another guy from Massachusetts went too. He wasn't a delegate. His name was Isaac Backus. And the Reverend Backus was a Baptist minister. And he wrote a pamphlet. He had written a pamphlet about taxation and representation. you know what? Baptists have to pay taxes in Massachusetts to support the Congregational Church, a church we don't go to. So isn't that taxation without representation? How can these guys from the Massachusetts Assembly, who are always gassing on about their commitment to liberty, tax us to support a church to which we don't belong? And of course, the delegates from Massachusetts are quite embarrassed that this guy shows up, and they're mortified when the other members of Congress give him a hearing. They even let him preach to the Congress. He gets to offer the prayers one morning. Boy, imagine if you're Samuel Adams, if you come here to get these folks on your side, and then you have this Baptist showing up saying, these guys are just as bad as the King of England. Well, what happens is, well, a couple of things happen here. Nothing really happens in Massachusetts. These guys say, oh, well, we'll look into it. And then they get home, and that's the last they'll say about it. There are, though, some folks who are not Baptists who think that the Baptists might have a point. One is James Madison, actually. And Madison, well, first, let me just say this. A couple of years ago, is anyone here an atheist, by the way? Okay, a couple of people are. I'm not going to start pressing you on this. But the leader of there's a leader of the National Atheists. Did you know this?
I'm more Jewish humanist.
A Jewish humanist. Okay, that is different. Do you belong to like the national organization? Okay. Yeah, kind of the point of atheism. Why do you belong to the organization? How about you? Okay, I don't want to step on anyone's toes. I don't know why I'm afraid of atheists, though. What are you going to do to me? Anyway, she said, if you value freedom of religion, thank an atheist, which I think is just absurd. I'll thank you for other things. You're nice people, and I'm sure you've done good things, and so on. But freedom of religion, no. If you want to thank someone for freedom of religion, if you value it, thank a Baptist first, okay? And then there's a long list of folks you can thank. Christian Scientists, Jehovah's Witnesses. Anyone here a Jehovah's Witness? I'm sure you would have made your presence known by now. But, these are the people responsible. Catholics, Jews, these are the ones responsible for freedom of religion, okay? Something we all enjoy. So the Baptists are pushing not for religious toleration. We just don't want, the real church to treat us nicely. We want to be on the same level. We want to remove the state from intrusion into areas of religion. And the Baptists are really the proponents of this. And in Virginia, where they form a very potent minority and make this good argument about why should the state intrude into areas of faith. And in Virginia, aside from the Baptists, there's a minister, John Leland, very important in this. But then we also have to thank a couple of politicians, and one is James Madison, who incidentally was an Episcopalian, or an Anglican. He had been baptized in the Church of England, and then he went to the College of New Jersey, which of course is now Princeton, and the College of New Jersey was a Presbyterian school. And when he was there, the Reverend John Witherspoon was the head of it. So Madison, Anglican from Virginia, goes to this Presbyterian school where he studies theology and philosophy. Never studies law, incidentally. And he comes back to Virginia at about the time this Baptist minister in Caroline County is being horsewhipped by the Episcopal minister and the sheriff is arresting the Baptist. And he begins to think, why does the government have an interest in what Baptists think, or in what church they go to? And Madison joins in this push for religious freedom for Baptists, for anyone. Then our friend Jefferson in 1777 comes back to Virginia, and the Constitution had been written. He still writes a Constitution for Virginia, which we don't need to talk about. But Jefferson is given the job in Virginia of revising Virginia's legal code. Now, all the laws that have been passed since 1619, when they set up a House of Burgesses, have to be revised. A, because they all mention the king somehow, but B, because Some of them were really bad laws or need to be overturned anyway. So Jefferson is sometimes, well, I shouldn't say what historians think about Jefferson, but he has this image sometimes of this dreamy philosopher writing the Declaration of Independence. Actually, his real important work was in the tedium of drafting legislation and doing this really mind-numbing stuff that takes a special sort of person to be able to do. So revise the legal code, something Jefferson loved doing. Threw himself into this, and one of the things he did was to draw up a statute for religious freedom. Probably the most important law ever passed by a state legislature. And it has this remarkable preamble, saying, a long kind of preamble. I put it up on our website for those of you who want to read it. Truth is great and will prevail if left to herself. She is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition, disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate. That is, you don't have the state bolstering one side or another of an argument. And errors cease to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. Okay, and then says, this is really the heart of the law. No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or beliefs, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. Okay? So you have this striking law. You're not going to be compelled to go to a certain church, support a certain church, nor enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened because of what you think. But you'll be free to profess whatever you do think. Okay? And this won't diminish, enlarge, or affect your civil capacities. So the Baptists among us, the atheists among us, the Jews among us can think whatever they want. And Jefferson writes in a letter where he sends a copy of this that this frees the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Jew and the papist, the Hindu and the infidel of any description. So many of the states, including Virginia, had in their articles, in their declarations of rights, a protection of, religious freedom, kind of a freedom of conscience that applied to Christians. Okay, so Catholics and Protestants, Congregationalists and Baptists would be on the same footing. The Virginia statute goes further. It doesn't say what religious beliefs we're protecting. It protects any of them, which is an astonishing thing. The Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, the Mohammedan, the Hindu, the infidel, all protected by this, able to argue whatever it is you think. And then he has a little coda at the end that no subsequent legislature can change this. Really an interesting thing. Jefferson, as I said, puts this as part of his whole revision of the laws of Virginia. The legislature doesn't pass it in 1779. The Anglican clergy are worried, what's going to happen to us if we no longer are allowed to collect taxes to support the Anglican Church? What is going to happen to them? I think I've asked, is anyone here an Episcopalian, and no one admitted to being one? What will happen to them if they're not supported by taxes? What will happen to society if we're not supporting a church? Every nation in Europe has an established church. And most countries have some kind of a moral establishment at the center. But here you're saying, no, there's not going to be an established church. So who's going to support the Episcopal clergy? I thought you were raising your hand to suggest something. Yes? The Episcopalians. Let them support it. Good idea. There's some resistance to this. Remember, who is in the majority in Virginia? The Episcopalians, right? So they're not willing to give this up. The Baptists, well, Patrick Henry, who leads the Virginia legislature in the 1780s, proposes a compromise. How about we do this? This is when the Baptists are beginning to gain grip. Baptists and the Madison argument are really gaining ground. I put up on the website Madison's remonstrance, his argument against having the state play a role in this. How about on your taxes you're able to designate what church this goes to? You know, so you three could designate, I don't know, the atheist group and Baptist group. Who would you send yours to?
Free thinkers.
The free thinkers. Okay, you might be one of the. I think we've found another free thinker here. The rest of everyone else is being rather reticent about their religious leanings for fear, I don't know, that I was going to start proselytizing. But does this sound like a good idea? A tax checkoff, like, you know, do you want to have on your taxes? Do you want to help support the presidential candidates in there?
No.
Why not?
Is it really, do you want to?
Well,
We have the choice. If that's the case, and you have a choice to say no as well.
yeah, I suppose, yes.
Well, you don't want to use the taxes as an identification.
I suppose, but that's if you don't want to have an established church. I mean, what are you trying to hide, Mr. Humanist? I see. Yes.
Could be the door that it opens to other things that you might be able to sign your taxes to.
Well, it could be, yeah, it could be. Well, interesting thing happens in Virginia. This tax write-off thing dies. Actually, James Madison in 1786 secures the passage of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in the Virginia legislature. So this is the great moment when this does. Yes, sir.
Just also, though, if your beliefs are yours and inalienable, then why are you paying taxes?
That's right, yeah. What role does the state have in this to say, and what if you change your beliefs? You know, you're paying taxes to support something, well, why? Let them scramble. And actually what happens as a result of this disestablishment in Virginia is a proliferation of religious believers. Madison notes this later in life, that, you know, suddenly we had been very secular 40 years ago. You know, the Episcopalians weren't real evangelicals, probably a reason why none of them is here tonight. But, you know, Virginia was becoming more religious because there wasn't a state interest in religion. Very interesting development here. The whole history of religious freedom. But as I said earlier, you know, we'll thank our atheist friends here. But the Baptists really are the ones who are responsible for this, along with James Madison, whose ideas, well, he does study theology in college, but he's not a theologian. Anyway, why don't we take a break at this point, and when we come back, we will talk about some other important developments in the 1780s.